Thank you, Edie. Thank you very much for hosting us for this summit. Congratulations on the election result and, indeed, on this European path and this confidence in the future, in the Europe that you have expressed. Thank you, and I am pleased to be here again for this 6th summit of the European political community and the first in the Balkan region. And so thank you for the immense hospitality and also for reminding us that behind the European dream and what unites us, Europe is not just a geography, but it is always a mythology, a narrative and a crossing. And to remind us that this Europe of the Renaissance, of the Enlightenment, that of peace, progress and culture is the one that inspired us and that, deep down, makes us want to do it. Nevertheless, we find ourselves at a moment in the life of our nations and of this region which, I believe, takes on a certain gravity, today's meeting, given the stakes we face. And in trying to prepare for this meeting, I was struck by the extent to which, and no doubt unprecedentedly, we have a challenge to our Europe today in terms of all security. And bringing together this broad Europe beyond the European Union, bringing together, precisely, among equals, all the heads of state and government and all the nations that are represented here, is trying to give our great continent a chance to face the challenges it faces through unity. And I think that unity among all of us is indispensable today given the threats and risks of division that weigh on the continent. Obviously, the first security is geopolitical security. You have both expressed it. And the threats of war, of division that strike Europe and which, at times, threaten its own unity. First of all, of course, is the Russian war of aggression in Ukraine. Volodymyr knows how much solidarity he has here. And I think that the battle that we're all fighting, that we carried our collectives last week with Kaya, Donald and Friedrich, the coalition of the willing that has been formed and is uniting a lot here around this table to support Ukraine is important. First, to obtain a ceasefire. And if need be, I believe that the last few hours have shown in this regard that Russia does not want a ceasefire. And if there is no increased pressure from the Europeans and Americans to obtain this result, it will not be spontaneous. And basically, Russia wants to resume discussions that are known, those held between February and May 2022, which did not prevent war crimes in Baku and elsewhere and which did not produce any results. We must push on this path and build a just and lasting peace for Ukraine. It is also all the work that is being finalized, and I hope that it will be completed and that will allow for a peace treaty between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And I really want to say to Nicole and Ilham our full support to all of us in obtaining the signing of this peace treaty on this path. It is to make progress on the issues that remain between Belgrade and Pristina. It is to give our support to Moldova, which is a victim of Russian interference every day. And it is a reminder of the importance of current elections which, here too, are, as we know very well, subject to such interference. And finally, as Antonio has just said, it means coordinating to provide a response altogether to the unacceptable humanitarian situation in Gaza, to obtain an immediate ceasefire, a humanitarian response, and then a political response, which is the only possibility of having a path that is key to the unity of the community. Our countries and the principles that we defend, but which is also the only way, in the eyes of the rest of the world, to be understood about what we are doing on Ukraine. And I am not comparing any situation, but I want to emphasize this for all of us. Most of humanity, China, India, the African continent, the Middle East, the Pacific and Asia and Latin America are watching us. Sometimes, they don't fully understand what we are doing about Ukraine, let's be clear, but we have to assume it and explain it. But they no longer understand us at all about Ukraine when we remain silent on Gaza. What they tell us, you are strange, you tell us that our lives are at stake when territorial sovereignty is attacked, and then you turn a blind eye when there is a massacre. And I'm not comparing anything, I know the stories, but I really want to wake us up here collectively on the coherence that we must maintain on these points. Deep down, we see it. All these situations show the need for peace, the need, obviously, to return through diplomacy, but this is the path on which we must find unity for our security and on which we must also build a collective response. And behind that, in order to be credible, there too, we need to have a common response. A large majority of us are part of NATO, but we also need to have a strong European pillar in NATO and to act as Europeans for our collective security. And the last few weeks and months have shown it. And Europe, the broad Europe, is taking on even more strength and relevance in the moment we are living in precisely to ensure its own security. The European political community is also the space that allows us to build security for our populations. And in this regard, the fight against drug trafficking and the fight against illegal immigration are essential issues that we have all begun to discuss together and on which I hope that we will be able to begin together to structure coalitions of states, international organizations and specialized European agencies to combat trafficking. In particular port and river transport, and to build data exchanges, fight against illicit financing, money laundering and corruption, and strengthen prevention programs. This is a battle that is key, which is awaited by our populations. All this trafficking is interlinked. And the European political community is also the space that allows us to build very concrete cooperation in this area. The third element is democratic security. Alain, it's the door to the many in all his speeches and through his organization, but we see through our elections, Romania is experiencing it at the moment. I mentioned it, Moldova experienced it very recently. We very clearly have threats that undermine integrity of our democracies, which undermine their resilience, and we are subject to manipulation during election periods, but foreign informational interference almost all the time. And this is something that undermines the democratic security of our Europe. And so, in the face of this and these famous FMISs, we launched in Blenheim the initiative that was carried out with Maya Sandu by creating a network of contact points at the EPC level to improve cooperation between us. And we need to go further by better protecting our critical infrastructure against cyber attacks, by strengthening our regulatory frameworks on illegal content online, and by tracking the financial flows that fuel these hybrid actions. But this democratic security is essential. Otherwise, in particular Russia, will continue to destabilize our public opinion to move the lines. The European Commission, I know, has initiatives underway, but what was carried out by Maya at Blenheim, I think, is an important point on which we can hang all this. Then the last point is economic security. I mentioned it in Budapest, but I think that we have not yet sufficiently taken the measure that we constitute a market of 700 million inhabitants. And this market has an extraordinary power. It is much bigger than the American market, it is much more coherent, and in fact, given the average standard of living, it is more structuring than the Chinese market. If we all know how to act together, it is enormous firepower. Firstly, by strengthening cooperation, by breaking down tariff barriers, by having regulatory convergence to make our greater Europe, something much more united in terms of trade and economic integration. It's all the debates we're having between the European Union and the United Kingdom and that are being held at the moment, but it's also the debates that we had and that you had structured, in particular, Alexandra and Eddie, on the whole region. But I hope that we can really go much further on this economic integration of the region, regardless of the issues of enlargement and the European Union. And I think that we must coordinate very strongly in order to deal with all external attacks or, basically, anything that creates unfair competition. We are all faced with American tariffs. Let's coordinate. We will be much stronger if we coordinate with a market of 700 million inhabitants and consumers. We are all faced with unfair competition from certain products from Asia because of differences in rules or over-subsidization of overcapacity. Let's coordinate. We will be much stronger to protect our markets and this commons. And so, I would like us to try to structure a reflection and work around economic security on a continental scale and therefore around the European political community. Those are the few words I wanted to say, but deep down, it is clear that our great Europe is at a time of geopolitical awakening. If we truly want to avoid abduction and rebirth, the myths kept depicting this, and ultimately, the great risk Europe is facing. I don't know if it will be Zeus, transformed into a bull, who will abduct it. What I do know is that the risks facing us are multiplying and that the European political community is a space that allows us to structure on the geopolitical and military levels in terms of the security and safety of our countries on the economic and democratic levels very concrete responses through coalitions of action. And so, for that, I think it's time, as was proposed by Victor and Eddie, the follow-up of a support coordination team to follow up on the concrete projects of EPC, which could be ensured by the Troika of Presidencies and the President of the European Council. And as a result, each time, to be able to plan the 2 future presidencies, which would allow us to have permanent troikas and a follow-up of the projects that we launch in this framework. In any case, Eddie, thank you for allowing us to meet in Tirana. And thank you for the hospitality and lyrical love of our Europe that you carry.